Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here today. I hope you're excited to be here today because we are going to talk about navigating hypergrowth. This is a series that we're kicking off at Netlify to talk to leaders in the industry about how companies are scaling. We're looking at talking to people who are trying to go from 0 to 100 or from 100 to 500 or even beyond that, right? So this is the first of the several conversations where we're going to be talking to people who have gone through that journey so that if you're doing the same thing, hopefully we can all share some stories and learn from each other. Today, we're kicking it off with one of my favorite people in the world, and also, as you'll see shortly, my stunt double, Chris Bach. Chris is he's one of the co-founders of Netlify. He is one of the funniest people I know, one of the kindest people I know, and he's also one of the best leaders in terms of making people feel like they are heard, appreciated, and cared for. And for that reason, we're going to talk to him today about how to create a company vision, how to build a company that people want to join and want to be a part of. So with that, let me go ahead and welcome him to the stage. Chris, come on.
What an intro. That's my favorite intro ever. Thank you so much.
Of course,
Aw.
I'm super happy to be talking to you. I think this is going to be an absolute blast. Um, and so, I guess, honestly, I'm just going to get right into this because there's so much that we want to talk about. There's so many things that I want to cover that I don't want to waste any time. So
Perfect.
here's what I'm going to start with. When you hear people talking about companies, there's a lot of jargon and different words that get used to describe making your company better. And some of these are terms about measurement. Some of these are terms about strategy. And some of these are terms about culture, right? And so we'll hear people say OKRs and roadmaps and all these other terms. So when we talk about a vision, right, a company vision is a very particular thing, but what makes it unique and why is it important for a company to have one?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, like, first of all, I think that there's a difference between, of course, how we measure progress and a company vision. I think the vision is our overlay, right? This is our reason for being in the first place as a company, right? This should be motivational. This should be something we can all rally around. This is what we're solving for, right? A vision always has to be, you have to be solving something for a group of people, if not everyone, right? And I think it's okay that the mission is elevated to as aspirational as it can be, while still obviously related to what it is you do. And I think a vision is important for everyone to stand behind, also for the sake of alignment, right? I mean, as we move into the different roadmaps, KPIs, and so on, I'll get back to. We use those as guardrails. We use everything as, how do we prioritize? How do we know what we should be doing next, right? And that's the overlay above them all, right? Is this helping us to build a better web? And if it's not, well, then we should reconsider, right? So everything should sort of align all the way up to the overlaying vision. And I do really think that alignment is everything, as we'll be talking a lot more about today as we dive into remote cultures and everything else.
Yeah. So I'm going to repeat something back and ask a follow-up question here.
Mm-hmm.
So what you just said is that if the vision is the direction, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of an arrow pointing in the way that we want to go as a company, and then the strategic parts are the guardrails that keep us moving in that way. So my follow-up question would be: do
Mm-hmm.
you feel that um, a vision is sort of, does it actually make it easier to plan? Does it make it easier to build out the roadmaps and things like that?
Absolutely. I mean, so you have a vision which can be to build a better web, right? And then you have the mission is, how do you do that? Well, you can build a platform and enable developers to build in a way that's more scalable and safer and faster for everyone else, right? And thereby sort of enhancing the reason for being for the open web, for example, right? And then as you move it and into everyday and quarterly operations and so on, then you'll start working with OKRs and KPIs and roadmaps, right? And they are all guardrails in our day-to-days, as I said before, right, to help us prioritize, right? But if that's not supporting the mission and the mission is not supporting the mission, then you're off, right? So I think that the vision is at the very end of it, why we get up and why we do this thing and why we sometimes work long hours and so on, right? It is because it's the thing that's the most motivational, right? So if you just tell someone to move something from A to B, and it's not connected to a grander purpose, well, then it's going to fall a little flat, right? It's going to be, well, why do I want to do that? Like so many other things I could be spending my time on. But if you see it in context, right, saying, this might be a practical, tactical thing that I'm doing here, but it supports an overall strategy, and that rolls up in an overall vision of making this something that I care deeply about, right?
Absolutely.
Better, then it's not just motivational, but it also creates alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said a word that I think is an interesting word, and so I'm gonna ask another follow up here,
Mm-hmm.
which is when you talk about purpose.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between like my purpose for existing on this planet or the purpose of a hammer, right? So when you're talking about purpose, how does that fit into the way you look at defining one for Netlify?
Well, I mean, again, purpose is also many different things, right? I believe, like for an individual, it doesn't matter what you do in the company, whether you're CEO or work anywhere else, right? Knowing what you're responsible for, what you're not responsible for, is one of the primary things that set people up for success, right? What is my purpose? What am I supposed to do? What does success look like? But the same thing goes for the company as such, right? What is our purpose? What is our reason for being, right? That should be the vision, right? So I mean, when you talk about purpose, it's sort of it has a story depending on where you're applying it.
Absolutely. So not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it, why it's
Obviously.
important.
Mhm.
I love that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about scale. So one of the things that gets interesting as a company starts to grow is when we start, there's 5 of us, 10 of us. We can all get into a conference room and have a pizza and talk about what we're going to do together and get on the same page. Um, we're well past that point. We can't get everybody onto every call. We can't have everyone knowing everything that's happening in the company. So as a company scales, uh, what are some of the strategies you're using to make sure that everyone in the company is getting enough context to understand the purpose and the vision?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing is that you have to realize that your communication paths are going to change as you scale the company, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's okay. Um, and it really is about transparency. It's about very clear communication. It's also about over communicating, saying the same thing again and again, especially as you're adding a lot of people. If you're in a sort of a hyper growth state, right? It's very important to do that. For me, a headline, and I'll talk about that a lot, is intentionality, right? You have to be super intentional about the small things, right? And intentional, for example, around, I know it sounds practical, but how do you share knowledge? What goes into Slack? What goes into email? What's persistent in what docs and so on, right? So everyone can find this information. What are you supposed to read? Like if you have Slack channels, everyone knows in any company that's listening in here that you'll very quickly have hundreds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So which one should you follow, right? Well, and which are optional, right? Again, like intentionality, very clear frameworks for how you communicate, and then repeating yourself. Like it sounds a little sort of mundane, but actually over communicating, it also helps to stress, and it's just a very basic human thing that okay, if it's being continuously said, it becomes sort of okay what we govern by, because there's a lot of people, and especially if you're a company where you want the best idea to travel from everywhere, right? And you're gonna have a lot of information, right? So if you don't give frameworks and tooling to navigate that communication, it's not going to end well, right?
Yeah.
It's actually going to end with smaller silos because I can't take this in. I don't know how to judge it. I don't know how to put it in context. I'm going to focus on this small sliver that I know is what I need to do now and next,
For
right?
sure.
And you're going to actually feel more disconnected. So having intentional in how you communicate and how you share knowledge is key. It really is.
For sure. So you said something that I love is there's a phrase that I hear a lot in Netlify, which is the best idea can come from anywhere.
Yeah.
And with what you're talking about with this kind of transparency and everything, there's a level of as you said, intentionality about making sure that information is flowing, especially from leadership down. What are the systems that you've put in place, or I guess some of the strategies that you've put in place to make sure that that communication can also flow back up, and so that the best idea can come from anywhere?
Absolutely. Right. Again, I think, well, it ties into the virtues and values, right? I mean, if the best idea has to come from anywhere, then you also need to know for any given project, who's the decision maker, right? So if I'm going to contribute my idea, a few things have to be into place, right? First of all, I need to know what decision is being made. What are the parameters here, right? Who's making the decision? Who's responsible for this area? And what is the way of me conveying feedback? I think very common misunderstandings like, oh, transparency is, or empowerment, for example, is that people are allowed to voice their opinion. Of course, that has to be in place. But the reality is that lack of transparency 85% of the time is why an idea doesn't travel, right? So hear me out. If you're a developer and you're working and you look up and you're marketing to developers, as we do in Netlify, if you say, well, I'm a developer, I don't know if I would say, you know what, I'm sure they have their reasons. I don't want to be an overhead of, I don't know, like they may probably have considered, and you look down again, idea hasn't traveled. But if you can go in with great async knowledge sharing and say, okay, this is the project, Todd is doing this, we're in wireframe stage, this is where I leave my comments, now the idea travels, right? Because most of us don't want to add unnecessary overhead, right? We want to be constructive in our feedback. So getting a really good framework for how we share knowledge, I'm repeating myself here, I know, right? But it's so important for the best idea to be able to travel from anywhere, right? Another reason, or another aspect that has to be in place is this idea of actually clear responsibilities and decision making. You can say, well, isn't that counterintuitive? But if you go into a room and no one knows who's going to make the decision, and everyone just voices out and talks about my decision, and everyone's just advocating whatever it is they want to do, right? Then people are very quickly going to feel jaded if they're not the ones being heard. It's very quickly becomes a little bit of a shouting match. A lot of the more people that are just by default a little more quiet will just keep more to themselves and so on. And at the end of it, the idea doesn't really travel. And then someone has to cut through at the end of it. Or you end up with sort of consensus making where we just get a compromise of everyone's opinion sort of rolled into one, right?
Yeah.
So I actually feel like the best idea travels better when there are very clear parameters, right? And so what you have to trust and what you have to educate is that whoever is responsible for this, your manager, whoever it might be, will really take and listen, right? And that has to be, that comes into place if you trust that they will make the decisions for the right reasons. So as soon as you're in a political climate where they're saying, well, I already made my decision and I cannot afford to be wrong here, right? Because that will be used against me. So I'm just going to sit here for 5 minutes and listen to what you say, and we're going to do what I already decided we're going to do. Well, then the idea won't travel anyway, right? So you have to be in a climate where whoever is responsible trusts that it's fine to change your mind, right? It's fine to say, oh, that idea is better than mine. That doesn't take away from you. No, on the contrary, right? If it's the right kind of company, that will actually make you a more sufficient leader, right? That actually means that if you're okay, because it's another way of admitting a weakness, right? Someone comes, especially if someone that's not sort of doing what you do, right? And then comes with an idea, and you sort of have to say, okay, well, that sounds great. Let's go and do that, right? Some people would feel like, oh, is that going to undermine my authority and so on, right? But the reality is that, of course, it won't, right? And if you trust people always to make decisions for the right reasons, then everyone around them, including their managers, will trust them with a lot more responsibility. So I know there's a lot of answers to the same questions, but they're all sort of they're all dependent, right? This is how the best idea truly travels.
Well, and as you're saying this, I can kind of, from what you said earlier, I can see how the vision starts to connect back to this, because one of the things that can become chaos is if you say, all right, the best idea can come from anywhere, and there's no clear vision, then you're going to get an inbox full of suggestions like, hey, we should turn into a pizza delivery shop. Hey, what if we became like produce rap music videos? And all of those could be good ideas, but the vision helps filter that so that we know, hey, I feel like we said we're doing this, and this doesn't feel like it's in alignment with our vision. I now know I can trust that I'm making a good suggestion that's not pulling us off topic or sending us off into a rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
No, I love that. I love that. So I'm curious, when you talk about this, traditionally we would do all of this in person. We would have our hallway tracks and our lunches and our team happy hours, where we got a lot of kind of in between spaces to have conversations and to discuss things without the structure of a meeting or agenda. Most of the world is moving to remote right now. Netlify just went from being hybrid to being fully remote. How are you creating these spaces to have these kind of abstract discussions about the things that aren't on agendas, and How do we communicate the vision in a way that's not just an all hands meeting? How are you approaching that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about institutionalizing culture in general, right? I mean,
Yeah.
how do you make that? And again, the headline is intentionality. So at Netlify, as you said, we were always a hybrid, so that we had Tuesdays and Thursdays as work from home days. And that's because 60% of us were already distributed, right? So in order to create a distributed culture rather than just be remote friendly. And by the way, that should always, in my opinion, be defined by that anyone working anywhere has an equal opportunity to shape culture, whether you work from home or not. And as we were sort of forced to go fully distributed last year, we saw that to us at least created a more equal footing for everyone, having a truly distributed team. That said, I think intentionality is absolutely everything, right? So nothing happens by itself. You don't sort of come across each other in the kitchen or go out for drinks after work. It doesn't happen as organically. We have to be honest around that, right? So there's a lot of small efforts, and they all make up, and those are the ones that count, right? So an example is, for example, we use Slack as a messaging tool, and in there we pair people at random for 30 minutes every week in what we call donuts, right? So it's just a virtual coffee where you chat about anything, right? We have
And that's an
Netlivation
app
days.
that
It's
people
an
can,
app.
yeah, anybody can install that and use that today.
Absolutely, you're right. You're right. Netlivation days, which we do quarterly, where everyone can sort of come up with their own projects, work across organizations, and create their own sort of mini teams, and do that. And often we'll take some of that and keep working on it. It'll be a real project for Netlify. And flying people together, actually having offsites and all hands, and taking that office budget and really mindfully applying it, right? Wherever you have hubs. That means that, hey, we have like 15 people in Portland. Well, make sure that those people actually get together on a regular basis, and so on, right? And then, whenever you communicate something, like just double click, are you communicating in the right place? If it's persistent data, don't just share it in Slack. Make sure that it's in a doc, and make sure it's the same place every time. So you create these trails of people that will always walk over here to see what's on the agenda for next week or whatever it is, right? And so asynchronous knowledge sharing, as boring and mundane as it may sound, is just like incredibly important when you're a remote company. Holy smoke, right? Like our handbooks, and I had to learn that as well. I thought, well, what tool we use? One of them, like, please go fix, right? And I had to admit, I should have been a little more careful there, right? Because then people were like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go over here. I'm gonna go over here, and what was meant for saying, well, anything, right? I want to empower you. You make the decision. Well, actually, ended up being a little very destructive, right? Not very constructive, at least. And so actually creating those really clear framework and expectations and so on is super important. So intentionality, both when it comes to getting real face time together, making sure you check in and you talk about other things, right? And I would also sort of add on to this, right, that it's been a tough year, a year and a half for a lot of different people, right, for a lot of different reasons. No need to dive into it. I think we all know what it is, right? But I do think that it creates more of a need of checking in more often. Like, just make sure everyone's okay. Make sure that they take the time they need in order to make sure that everything in outside of work is also in harmony, right? We're all humans, and it's not like we have a work life and a private life. It's going to be an organic mess for most of us, right? So I do think that we carry some responsibility to make sure that people are in a good place.
Absolutely. And this ties into something you said earlier, which I'd love to dig into. You use the phrase values and virtues. So when you talk about that in the context of a company, what does that mean? How are you defining these, and what role do they play?
Well, I think like values and virtues, I think what we talked about before, another way of saying that is like, it's very important that they're not just aspirational, but they're actionable, right? They have to translate into behavior. I've seen so many that just have a list of plus words. Oh, we want to be innovators. Okay, so, well, can you say that anyone wants to not be innovators, right? Like, try to make it sound like your company, and then having it actionable. Like, is this something that you can turn around and interview for example, when you're adding team members, right? Do we understand what that translates into? What kind of person would work well in a Netlify setting or whatever other company setting, right? And that's expectations to how we work together, and what kind of work we want to do together, but very, very often in how do we want to interact with each other, right? What's acceptable behavior, what's not so great, right? And yeah, how do we give each other room to breathe, but how do we also create as much harmony as we can, right? And so I think the values and virtues, they can be very different for very different companies, but really try to not just have them aspirational, right? Like make them close. I think that I learned is that it has to be close to your DNA. It has to be something that you can really stand by. I think transparency is one of the things that we work a lot on at Netlify, right? And empowerment, which is sort of the foundational values and the virtues we have of Netlivation, which has to be like, can we create simple solutions to very complex problems, which is what very much is what Netlify is about, right? But also things like, how do you put together an organization that is put together of people from all walks of life in I would say, a diverse organization, right? I mean,
sure.
I think it's very, very important that if your audience is everyone, which is often the case, at least it is in Netlify's case, right? Anyone building for the web,
right.
Well, then you have to understand that a diverse organization is by default more intelligent. Right, you have to attack problems from that angle, right, and of being able to see things from all points of view, and you have to understand that your customers are buying for different reasons, with different profiles, like to be spoken to and educated, and so on in many different ways, right? And I think a diverse organization is going to be much more successful in doing that, right? And that also requires a lot of intentionality.
Absolutely. Well, so that is, that 20 minutes flew by, but I see we've got a list of questions. So let's take 10 minutes here and answer some questions. So Tobias, I hope I didn't just murder the pronunciation of your name, asks, in Netlify, how transparent are you around things like sharing revenue and profit? How do you communicate that with the team?
Great question. We always sort of said we have board meetings, right? So we venture back company, and we do have board meetings. And every time we do that, obviously we make a deck, and that's going to be focused on business results. And we take that deck. We just did it this morning actually, and we flip it and we share it with the whole company. We very much want to give context as much as possible. So yeah, we're extremely transparent when it comes to those things. The results and the different dashboards are accessible to all along. We have weekly meetings, of course, on these things where everyone can pop in. But yeah, we do share these things as well in company all hands every time we have a board meeting. So yeah, very, very much so.
Yeah.
And also, I think the motivations behind it. What's important for us, right? Why is this number important? Like, what does it reflect on us, right? What's more important? We're trying to build a standard for how the web is built, right? And we want to enable people and how we're doing on those things, right? And really practice a lot on translating that into something where we can all measure our progress, right? I also think that's a very real thing for companies, right? That it can't just all be intent. We have to be good at knowing how we measure, are we moving forward in the right way.
And that's something that I think is just for me, having come from companies that weren't super transparent about these things. A lot of times I found myself doing work and I felt like, okay, but why? Why does this matter? Like, okay, so I build this dashboard. Who cares? Like, what is it actually changing? And one of the things that I have really appreciated about the transparency is the fact that you're drawing a line from, I'm going to write this code today, and it goes all the way up the chain to, it created this percentage growth for our company. We know that it made an impact. We know that this is helping us get toward our goals and that it's actually making a real impact. So I think that's it really is very much appreciated. I think a good tip for all the leaders out there is to paint that context, show people why this stuff matters. We got another question from Brendan. Brendan asks, how do you deal with misunderstandings around a goal or vision? So part of your team gets it consistently, but others seem to regularly miss the point.
Try again. I mean, like, it is just so important. You need alignment. You need people to understand why we're here, and you need to share that understanding. So I would try to double click on, is it because there's a sort of a fundamental miss, and say like, well, I was hired here to go over here, right? So that's the story I bought into from the very beginning. So you might say something this, but it's not aligned with the vision I have or my understanding of why I'm here in the first place, right? And so I would really double click on, how did they end up there? Like, is there a manager there that hired them that you have to sit down and talk about and say, yes, these are your responsibilities, but our overall vision is this, right? And these responsibilities always have to carry into this, right? So very often when there's a part of a team that gets it consistently wrong, it's because there's communication trickling down that is very aligned. It can also be because there's someone coming and saying, you know what, this is what they told us to do, but we're going to do it. I'm just going to, consent and say whatever, right? But I'm not really sort of buying into it, right? I mean, you can just imply that, and then everyone on that team is just going to say, oh, okay, right. But that, and very often they do that because they weren't allowed to voice in the first place. They just got, told this is where we're going, right? And so it wasn't a, result of conversation. We often talk about if you don't have weigh-in, you don't have buy-in. And if you don't have buy-in, you don't get commitment. If you don't have commitment, you don't have alignment, right? So it all starts there. And before that, I would talk about, how do you get that buy-in? Well, you have to trust each other that there's no ill will. You have to trust each other that mistakes and so on are not going to be politicized and used against you. Basically, you have to have sort of a foundation of vulnerability-based trust. But maybe that's a chapter for another conversation. But yeah. I mean, very often it comes in the something being misaligned along those 5 steps.
All right. Dave asks, how do you motivate people, and how do you decide if it's time to part ways? So I guess, in what you were saying about getting everybody aligned, like at what point does it cease to become a failure of communication on the org and start to become just the right time to move on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, right? I mean, any startup will always tell you fire quickly, and there's truth to that. But we also all empathetic, and we want to make sure that we go as fast as we can to make someone successful. I would say, be careful when hiring. Make sure that the success parameters are crystal clear, right? Yes. That's the big one, because you can always go back and say, hey, this is what we need you to do. This is the parameters that we need you to succeed within, right? And you get that agreement up front, right? And then also helps if you go to, for example, performance review and so on, right? There's no clear-cut answer, but of course, if we're not aligned on the basics, right, on how we treat each other or what our vision is, then I think it's just saying, hey, this is not going to be a match. Right? Then arrive to that quicker rather than later, right? Because bad behavior can also be really detrimental for morale for everyone else on the team, right? And if they see that someone gets away with it, that can be a little tough for the team morale, right? And it can quickly sort of spread ill will and bad vibes. But again, we all want people to be successful, right? So I think clarity of what's expected and how, you tell this person, this is how it's going to work, right? So there's no doubt at all. And then if they can't, then there's a sort of a clear expectation. Well, that leads to a performance review or whatever. And then,
yeah.
And that's it. I have a thing with a pen. I put it in. Sorry about that.
No worries. So I have, there's a question here from Gabrielle, which I think is, it's related, and I think it's actually a really interesting one when you've got a small company, which is, how do you manage when you've got different team members who are all gunning for the same job? So you've got 3 people who want to move into a lead role or who want to take over a department, and you're a small company, you've only got one of those roles open. How do you make that how do you prevent that from becoming a problem or an attrition risk?
It is an attrition risk, right? Because if people are sort of strongly motivated to move to a place and they don't see that it's happening in the near future, that can lead to attrition. I think it's a tough one, right? But I think, again, clarity is super important. Also, sitting down and understanding, what is it you want? What is the title? Why do you want this? Right? And some people will say, well, I like the responsibility. I want to work with people, right? And others will, it's actually the kind of technical lead responsibility that I want, right? With engineering, but in a lot of different ways. You can be an IC or you could be a people manager. There's actually several different ways to progress, right? And then you can say, well, what we need is a technical lead, more or less, we're a tiny team. We don't really need people management. And that's really where you want to excel. I think we can provide a different path with you that might take a little longer and we'll get there, right? Or I would say and I would make really specific around what does this person need to be able to do, and how do we value experience and so on in that, right? So people feel like there's a more sort of objective reasons for one getting it over another. So it's not just, it doesn't feel like a roll of a dice, because then it's much easier to feel jaded, right? But if you feel listened to, if someone can provide a path forward for you, even if it isn't that immediate job, right? And you feel like, okay, there's objective reasons that I can agree to or not, right? But that is behind this, right? And it's not personal. It's not because someone doesn't like me or doesn't value me, right? Or think that I'm not good enough, right? I think if you can accommodate some of those things, it becomes easier to keep everyone motivated, even though you do need to promote one for the job and can't do it for all three. But I don't want to sound naive, and of course there's always going to be personal ambitions involved and so on, and you handle it as well as you can.
So we have we are technically over time, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. For everybody who is not going to get their question answered, you can send Chris a message on Twitter. Just tweet at him, and we'll get some answers there.
Absolutely.
But let's make our last question here is going to be from Bram, and it is, any tips for setting up a knowledge sharing framework, and at what moment should you start doing this? I think when he says properly, I'm interpreting that as formally.
Yeah, sooner than we did. Is the short answer. I think I became intentional at this a little later than I would have liked to, right? Of really sort of understanding how important it was, right? Like this is not a nice to have. This is like a total need to have. Like, we're not going to scale without it. What we ended up with, and that also due to the nature of Netlify in our business, we build our own handbook. So it's completely made by us, right? And we're building it out now as well. But I would say knowledge sharing framework, it also depends. If you're a production company, right, and you're always going to be the same 5-10 people, the answer is different. If you're a software as a service, you're venture backed, and you have growth plans of multiplying the team many times over a few years, then it's almost never too soon, right? I would like say, okay, maybe not when you're 2 people, but even then, like, start thinking about it, like start like weighing in on what would be meaningful, right? I do think that that is going to help you a lot, like the intentionality around it, and especially if you're remote. If you're remote, I would say as you start the company, like that's as soon as you want to start doing it. Whether or not you have the resources to build it out yourself, or you use a tool that's already there, is a different question.
Yeah. Well, Chris, this has been an absolute pleasure. The time flew on by. I wish we could talk about this all day, but we are out of time. Thank you all so much for hanging out. Thanks for so many great questions. There are questions about recordings that we are recording them. I don't know when they will be available, but rest assured they will be. And we will make a whole bunch of noise on the Netlify Twitter account, on Chris's Twitter account, on my Twitter account. So keep your eyes open. And stay tuned for the next one. We're going to be talking to some great leaders from Launch Darkly and from Netflix and the rest of the series. Cannot wait for it. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, everyone. Such a pleasure. Thanks, Jason. Bye.